So before we move forward, notice we still in main screen.dart and we have this book search page here. So I think it'll be a really good idea to actually move all of this outside to its own class, to its own file. All right, let's do that. I'm going to select all of this, cut it, and we're going to go to our widgets, okay? And let's create a new file. I'm going to call this book search page.dart. Paste it all in. We'll need to do some importing here. Material, and let's see what else can we do. Import that as well. Let's go back here because we created all of this. I'm going to just cut this and add up there. Okay. And this guy, I'm going to import library dart. Okay. There we go. So it should be good. Let's go to our main screen. We'll probably have to do this. Yes, just import that package. Okay, we should be all good. Now we don't have to rely on being on the same class or file there. If we go back here, we should be able to see the same results. Just doesn't matter what we type, really. And then go to terminal, and we should see that we should at least see the information. Okay, very good. So things are still working as expected, but we just refactored some code. Obviously, the idea is to get all of the books here, because if we go back to the actual app, users can come up here and they can search for building. Let's call this, let's say building mobile apps like this, hit enter, and then this should happen, right? The books should be populated. That's the idea. You noticed in our code, we're doing everything manually, which means we're getting the items and then we're invoking volume and then go to title. Although that can be done, as you see here, but it would be nice to create a data class, right? So that we can use that data class, that object, so we can then populate it, all of its fields, and then retrieve information from its fields. And it's much easier that way instead of doing this. So in this case, we're going to create a book class that will represent an entity of a book. So one of these guys. But we need to figure out what are the fields that we want to get, right? Because as we look, when we look at this payload, there's a lot of information for each book, right? There's all of this metadata, there's title, subtitle, authors, publisher, published date, description of the book, there's industry identifiers and all this information. Some of this is not something that we want. We just want certain fields. And so we need to decide what fields we want to retrieve. So let's go and create the actual class. So I'm going to go here. We actually have a model created already, book model we created a long time ago. Okay, it has all this. Now this is not going to work. We're going to change a few things here because we want to make sure that we match exactly some of these fields that we have here. Okay, so we're going to do some changes in our book. All right, so the string ID will stay, the title, the author, notes will stay, categories will stay, and description also will stay. Let's add one more field here called user ID. It's going to be string. Call this user ID. This user ID, that means each book will be attached to the user that added the book. So if the logged in user is me, Paulo, and I have my user ID or UI ID, I'm going to attach that UI ID to each book. That way it's easier for us to later to say, okay, give me all the books of the current user. Well, who's the current user is the user ID that we have attached to this particular book. It looks like we're going to have issues here. Let's go ahead and add final properties. There we go. And this will also complain because there's something else that needs to be added. Let's see. I think it needs the user ID. Let me just copy this. Let's move this to be inside. So it's actually a named parameter like this. Okay, that's why it wasn't working. All right. I think for now, this should work. Just get the most important one, but one more before. Let's add the string, the photo URL. So after notes, I can say final string photo URL. And of course, we're gonna have some issue. I'm gonna say this.photo URL. And then let's make sure also we pass it all here as well. So that should work for now. We may add more fields later, but at least for the basics, in fact, we will add more fields later, but at least for now, this should work. Okay, so we're gonna have ID of the book. So this case is gonna be document ID. We have the title, author, notes. This is gonna be our own notes later we're gonna add to the book. Photo URL. So these are the fields that we're gonna be getting. Some of these are the fields we're gonna be getting from the payload here, like image links and so forth, right? So we're gonna get some of those image links. So that way we have the URL to the photos for this book, the thumbnail, if you will. Actually, let's keep adding a few more here. I'm gonna say string. I'm gonna get the page count. If we go back to our payload, you can see that we should have page count for each book. There we go, page count. It's an integer, actually, because you can see here it's not inside of double quotes or single quotes. So I need to change this to int, okay? And what else? Let's add published date. There it is. It is indeed a string. This is what we're gonna add, okay? All right, let's go and make sure that all of these are here as well. Page count, and then this dot published date, like that. Forget comma, and we're gonna do the same thing here. Okay, should be good for now. So back to our book search page. What we want to do now is to work on our FetchBooks. Now we know that things are working, meaning we're able to fetch information and we can see the books and so forth. But we need to make this a little bit more sustainable, if you will. In this case, we are going to make this a feature that will return a list of books, because then we want to use the list of books and do whatever we want to do. In this case, show them to the user. So I'm going to say, so here I'm going to say future, like that, and angular brackets to say now the types I'm expecting to return is going to be a list contain book objects, like this. And of course, we need to import our book. It says this function has to return a type of future list book. That's fine. We'll deal with that in a second here. And so inside now of our book, FetchBooks that is, get rid of that. I'm going to create a list that will contain books types. I'm going to say books, and first it's going to be empty, because we need to fill this up as we receive all these books, right? As we go through, we're going to fill this books list with books objects. So inside here, I'm just going to comment that out. One of the things we're going to do here is just create that book and then add to our books list and then return the list through this method. So whoever called this fetch is going to get the fresh books that have been searched. So let's say book, call this search book. I'm going to say new book, just creating a new object essentially. And then I'm going to construct this book. So for instance, for the title, how do I get a title? Well, the title is going to be title. Well, for the title, we have to do what? Let's go back to our payload. To get the title, we're inside of items already, right? Because if we're inside of a loop, we need to go to volume, info, and then get a title for each of these books that we are receiving. So in this case, I'm going to say item, because I'm inside of this loop, and then say volume, info, and then I'm going to parse through to get the title as such. Okay. And I'm going to continue with other types. Let's say author, do the same thing. Let's just copy this author. Just make sure that we're doing the right thing. It's authors. Okay. So if that's the case, if we're talking about just authors, what we want to do, because a book will always have an author, right? Even though it says authors here, because it could have more than one author. But we know it's usually going to have at least one author. So I'm just going to go ahead, because I know this is a list. I'm just going to go ahead and always get the first author. Okay. So to do so, I'm just going to say something like this and put 0. Okay. Now, here's a problem. Now we can continue as it is right now. Continue doing this for all of the fields, if you will, for our book that we are constructing here, a book object. But it would be really nice, for a few reasons that I'm going to show later, to extract this whole thing here, what we're doing internally, into a string somewhere, into a variable outside. That way it's much, much easier for us to deal with. What I mean is, I'm going to do this following here at the top. I'm going to say string title, and then I'm going to just extract this. But even further, I discovered this after a lot of headaches. Sometimes this API returns nothing for some fields. And that's very problematic, because then you'll get these errors that are really hard to decipher, which means your app will crash. So in this case here, what we're going to do, just to make sure we don't get into trouble, we're going to say if that is null, then we're just going to pass a string that says not available. Else, then we do this. Okay. So this is just to save ourselves in cases that the titles or any of these fields again come in as null, and we won't want our app to crash. Okay, this helps for now. There's different ways to do this, but we're going to go with it. So then I'm going to do the same thing with other ones. So string author, and it's null, not available, s, just pass that string author like that. I'm going to do the same thing with other fields that we're going to get in, because I don't want this to be too long, because I don't want to bore you. I'm just going to pause and copy and paste all of the other fields. All right, so I copied and pasted all of the other fields. The same thing, there's really nothing new here. I don't want you to feel abandoned. We'll do the same thing. For instance, for description, we go in and find description, right? If it's null, we're going to say not available. Else, we're going to get that description because there's something in there. Page count, we're going to do the same with page count. Categories. Categories has the same thing as we saw with our author, meaning it's an array or list, right? So we're just going to go ahead and get the first category that appears. Okay, and there. And so now it's easy for us just to say, safely pass in the title string, which is this string here, right? It's going to go and check to make sure everything is good and pass in that string, in this case the title, and then the author, just pass in the author, and then let's pass the photo URL. In this case, I'm going to say thumbnail, that's what we named, description, published date, page count, passing the page count, categories, passing the categories. All right, so we've constructed our search object there. What we need to do next is, because remember, we're still inside of our for loop here. We're looping through the list and want to create those book objects. But once we create those book objects, right away, we want to add them to this list of books. That way we can return that list, because that is the whole idea when we say fetch books. So I'm going to say books. It's a list, indeed, that requires books, right? So we say that add and pass in search books, or search book, that is, this object. Each time we loop through, we're going to create a book and add that book to our books list. And of course, I'm going then to have to return our books array like this. All right, so in the next video, we are going to see if this fetch books actually works.